Hello everyone, you are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan. Today we have a special episode concerning one of the most iconic and beloved of all mammals, the dog. There can be no doubt that our love of domestic dogs is global. On the latest estimates, over 470 million dogs are kept as pets worldwide, and that's over 100 million more than cats. And then add to that around 430 million dogs that exist as feral or strays. The common expression that the dog is man's best friend has been traced first of all to Frederick the Great, who ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1772, alongside a well-regarded Italian greyhound. But it seems reasonable that the phrase rang true since the earliest times that our ancestors spent with dogs. Speaking of which, where did the dog come from? Who domesticated them? Where were they first tamed? Did people keep them as pets from the beginning, or did they use them for other means? During this episode, I'm going to try and answer some of these questions and more, illuminating the over 30,000-year-old story of domestic dogs. So let's do it. Of course, we could begin our story of dogs way far back in time to the dawn of the clade Canidae, which includes the dogs, wolves, foxes, jackals, and their ancestors. This lineage has been traced back some 36 million years to small weasel or raccoon-like mammals with flexible tails and short limbs. Genera like Prohesperocyon evolved as small omnivores on the North American continent, subsequently spreading across the globe throughout the Cenozoic era. The genus Canis itself is much younger, on the order of 5.3 million years old. They evolved in Eurasia from earlier genera like Eusyon, which was now roughly jackal or coyote-sized, who had expanded there millions of years earlier. Now, members of the genus Canis today include the golden jackal, the Ethiopian jackal, and the various types of wolves, which, perhaps confusingly, includes the coyote. Now, the gray wolf, Canis lupus, seems to have evolved around 800,000 years ago in Eurasia and spread their range across the Holarctic region. So that's throughout Eurasia and into Beringia, which neighbors North America. Now, these wolves, as they are today, were now large-bodied pack-hunting predators who could work together to take down animals as large as bison and elk. However, around 20 to 15,000 years ago, things would begin to change as the last glacial maximum kicked in. Homo sapiens, as well, had by now expanded its range across much of the continental landmasses. Thus, intense pressures set in that many wolf populations couldn't handle, and they began to die out, creating a series of population bottlenecks that funneled much of the wolf's genetic diversity into a few refugia. It was the wolves that descended from these population bottlenecks that would go on to repopulate great swaths of northern Eurasia, expanding deeper into North America as well as Europe, giving us today's Arctic wolves, Mexican wolves, Indian wolves, Arabian wolves, and more. Now, it should be emphasized that recent research on many of these so-called wolf subspecies has called into question this classification scheme, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. What's particularly important is that the domestic dog represents the subspecies of the gray wolf that we know scientifically as Canis lupus familiaris. So, all of our domestic dogs are gray wolves, not just descended from them. But here's the catch. All the genetic evidence biologists have been able to sequence and study tell us that the dog was domesticated from a now extinct population of wolves, one of those that ended up extinct during the last glacial maximum. So none of the living wolf populations in Eurasia or North America can be claimed as the ancestral population of dogs. Today's wolves and dogs have spent the same amount of time evolving following these population bottlenecks of over 15,000 years ago. And that being said, in the time since the first domestication, dogs have interbred many times with wild wolves, so the DNA of both flow in each other. So as much as dogs are wolves, you could also argue that today's wolves are dogs themselves. So how did people go about domesticating wolves? If wolves are such powerful predators, hunting in groups to kill and eat even larger game, why on earth would we want to associate with them? They could seriously do us some damage. A very popular and conventional model suggested that wolves self-domesticated themselves, coming into close contact with our campsites to take advantage of our leftovers. The friendliest wolves, that is, the ones that acted the least aggressive out of the pack towards humans, would stay around people for longer periods of time, and perhaps even let them be played with, and so the aggressive and dangerous wolves would have been driven off or killed. And over the generations, the wolves would grow tamer and tamer through these simple interactions until we approach something like a dog. And this would all take place independently of human actions. We would not have purposely domesticated the wolves over time to be tamer, they would have done so themselves, just through their interactions with us. Now, this model found its roots with the work of Ray and Lorna Coppinger in the 1990s, and has been championed a number of times by several researchers, including Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods. But it has also attracted a share of critiques. In a 2022 paper, Frederick Range and Sarah Marshall Paschini reviewed the evidence and performed their own experiments with both wolves and domestic dogs, and came to the conclusion that the self-domestication model likely does not explain how dogs came to live with us. Domestic dogs show no less levels of fear, aggression, and cognition than wild wolves do. On the contrary, they actively try to avoid any conflicts they can with higher-ranking individuals, and that includes us, and are more likely to follow orders and social norms to do so. There are also other concerns with this model. First of all, because wolves and humans are both apex predators, the former almost always tries to avoid the latter, due to the principles of competition. And secondly, because dogs were domesticated in a time of mainly nomadic hunting and gathering groups traveling from place to place, this would bring individual wolves into the territory of other packs, thus increasing the risk of deadly conflict with said packs. In fact, in her 2021 book, Our Oldest Companions, Pat Shipman recounts a trip to Yellowstone National Park, where she witnessed a single wolf enter the territory of a pack of about 12 and proceed to be ripped to shreds by the entire pack. So it's more likely that humans did play a more direct hand in domesticating the wolf. But even so, how? You would think that it would be difficult to house and feed a wolf enough fresh meat to survive. Even many zoos have trouble with this. But ancient peoples may not have had much issue at all. Ethnographic accounts of Western anthropologists and explorers have shown that many indigenous American groups, including the Blackfeet, Skokomish, and Ignalik, often brought wild wolf pups into their settlements, and were sufficiently fed and tamed enough to even perform jobs like sled pulling and assistance in war between groups. Indeed, as mentioned before on the show, peoples around the world have brought in many types of animals into their lifestyles, including eagles, bears, monkeys, and cassowaries, and reared them like pets while not necessarily domesticating them. Therefore, it doesn't seem unreasonable that early peoples did just this with wolves. Now, the path to total domestication was probably much easier with wolves than it was with all those other animals, because both wolves and humans live in highly social groups, where communication and cooperation is frequent enough to reinforce pro-social behaviors. So when people brought in pups and raised them, they were simply exchanging one pack for another. Once there, the people's curiosity and fascination with the wolves would have transformed into a growing need for companionship and comfort, and wolves would have stayed longer in the communities and perhaps were bred with other tamed wolves, and the wolves would have grown very attached to their owners as well. Research from 2022 by Christina Hansen-Wheat and colleagues has shown that reared wolf pups, and not just domestic dog puppies, will readily show attachment behaviors to their human caregivers and distinguish between them and strangers. This suggests that the bond itself was one of the first pathways towards full domestication. Over time, the ancestral features of the wolves would have been changed by this process. As is seen in other animals for which this has been tested, even something as simple as a breeding exercise to increase friendliness would have changed the wolf's genetic structure to give them a new phenotype, with a shorter muzzle, smaller teeth, smaller brains, reduced and floppy ears, curly tails, and depigmentation of the skin to give them spots and patches of white or brown. In time, even the reproductive cycles would have changed, giving the wolf a more frequent estrus cycle. The early domestic dogs, then, would come to resemble something like a young wolf pup more than an adult, and this is what we would call a neotenous phenotype. So, should this model stand scientific scrutiny, and many researchers have championed such a model, when, where, and who would have gone through all of that? Based on the evidence we have, it seems that the wolf may have actually been domesticated on two separate intervals, but only one of these has survived to give us all the domestic dog breeds we see today. As I'll explain in a moment, the first instance occurred as early as 36,000 years ago by people of the Gravettian culture in Eastern Europe, while the second instance occurred at least by 23,000 years ago among the ancient North Eurasians of Central Eurasia. The archaeological record points to the oldest known dog on the latter line as having been buried 14.2 thousand years ago. But the genetic evidence has lent support to the earlier 23,000 year date, so archaeologists just have to look for them. Pat Shipman has dubbed the earliest domesticated wolves as wolf dogs, while her colleagues have termed them Paleolithic dogs. For the purposes of this show, we'll stick with wolf dog for the early experiments and save Paleolithic dog for the ones ancestral to the living types. Evidence of wolf dogs has been unearthed at many sites in Europe, including France, Germany, Belgium, the Czech Republic, and Central Russia, consisting of at least 40 individuals. They have what you would call an intermediate anatomy between wild wolves and true domestic dogs. Their skulls, jaws, teeth, and limb bones show that they have been bred to be distinct enough from wild gray wolves, but not so much as to be clearly identified as a domestic dog of the modern variety. In fact, prior to genetic studies, zooarchaeologists, that is, archaeologists who look at animal remains at human sites, often struggled to identify the remains of so-called wolf dogs. Depending on who you asked, they were either true wolves, true dogs, or it was just unclear. But now that we have ancient DNA, we know now that the wolf dogs represent a now extinct lineage of domesticated canines that lived alongside humans but has since died out to be displaced by the ancestors of the modern dogs. The sites where these dogs were found coincide with an Upper Paleolithic archaeological culture called the Gravettian, and this is characterized by prismatic stone tools, the curious Venus figurines, and a more semi-sedentary lifestyle than nomadic foraging. Recent genetic work, in fact, just this year, has shown that the Gravettian was actually a shared culture between two ancient European populations that entered the region at different times. The Gravettians were skilled hunters, and the sites of massive and extensive bone and hide dwellings in Eastern Europe, much less the delicate ivory jewelry that has been found at some burials, tell us that they heavily utilized woolly mammoths. Being the largest mammals in this part of Eurasia, it would have taken considerable skill, patience, and risk to hunt them. At the site of Predmosty in the Czech Republic, dated between 27 and 26,000 years ago, the skulls of 3 wolf dogs were unearthed. The scale of the dogs is impressive. They are much heavier than, say, a Siberian husky, and one was buried with what seems to be a mammoth bone fragment between its jaws, and you can see this in the photo here to the left. It is fully conceivable that some of these dogs may have been specifically bred to assist in mammoth hunts, whether that be driving them into suitable killing zones or even participating in a direct attack on, say, a younger individual. However, analysis of collagen samples from these dogs show that they were mainly being fed reindeer meat, while the humans had the honor of eating the mammoth. What's curious is that the remains of wild wolves from nearby sites show that they also ate mammoth. So humans must have recognized the value of having wolves to help them hunt the great beasts, and so selected these sorts of animals for their purposes. But otherwise, they kept them penned or perhaps tied off so that they could not take the owner's mammoth meat for themselves. We think these wolf dogs must have been highly valued because some of the burials were found in large cemeteries and laid with grave goods. At archaeological sites, animal burials within human communities almost always belong to pets, or captive animals in a menagerie-like setting. There's good reason to believe these wolf dogs were domesticated and coexisted deeply with their human companions. And indeed, in the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe, the accompaniment of wolf dogs may have even helped early Homo sapiens survive here in the first place. Their assistance with hunting expeditions, guarding, their sense of smell and attention to danger, and their intimate bond would have been great assets for Paleolithic peoples who coexisted with other large predators like bears, lions, and hyenas, not to forget our close relatives, the Neanderthals. Pat Shipman has even gone as far as to argue that Homo sapiens groups and their dogs may have even played a role in the reduced range and eventual extinction of the Neanderthals in Europe. But to date, we have no direct evidence of this. But we do see a clear rise in big game sites across Ice Age Europe with the Gravitans compared to earlier groups like the Aurignacians. Now, before proceeding, I want to give a special shout out and thanks to Maija Kerala for allowing me permission to use her artwork shown here at the right. This is a hypothetical scene showing a little Gravitan girl napping alongside some of these wolf dogs. You can get a sense of the near wolf-like appearance these animals may have had, which is a far cry from the later dog breeds we know so well today. As mentioned earlier, these wolf dogs seem to have left no discernible descendants, and instead the direct ancestors of Canis lupus familiaris seems to have been the result of another domestication event sometime before 23,000 years ago. This finding is the result of recent genetic studies that have compared the genetic lineages of both dogs and humans, which have shown fairly strong correlations. This suggests that these dogs traveled closely with their human companions, and these migrations can be traced in their DNA, which has been done to highlight the population expansions of our species in myriad studies. Thus, it has been argued that the people who domesticated the modern dog were the ancient North Eurasians, an ancient population and source of genetic ancestry that was detected within the last couple of years from a number of archaeological sites, including the Malta Bure cultures to the west of Lake Baikal, the Yana rhinoceros horn site of northeast Siberia, and the Afantova Gora sites west of the Yenisei River. They appear to have shared a common ancestry with the early European Paleolithic peoples, like the Gravitans, around 39,000 years ago, and seem to have originally lived across a wide swath of Central Eurasia, thus coming into contact with other peoples. The DNA of Amerindian peoples shares a 37% similarity to the ancient North Eurasians, and the Indo-European-speaking Yamnaya peoples, who would go on to settle much of Western Eurasia during the Bronze Age, share a roughly 25% similarity. Now, today, the ancient North Eurasians no longer exist as a people. They've undergone a significant genetic bottleneck. The famous mummies of the Tarim Basin in northwest China that were buried between 4,100 and 2,000 years ago have been shown to be an ancient North Eurasian people who experienced gene flow with the ancestors of the Highland Tajiks before seemingly vanishing within the neighboring populations. Anywho, it must be stressed that we do lack definitive evidence of early dogs in this part of the world at that time, but at most we can make a few speculations based on other lines of research. For example, 23,000 years ago puts us right within the last glacial maximum, which is one of the coldest and harshest phases of the recent ice age. For a people who were living on the Eurasian steppes, having dogs would have been as much of a blessing as it was for the Gravitans in Europe. Human populations in Central Eurasia appear to have been very small and often isolated from each other, and were hunting animals like reindeer, steppe bison, and even brown bears. The remains of larger game animals like mammoths are very few in these cases. But they also must have utilized many other species like subarctic birds, small carnivorans, as well as any local tundra and taiga plants. The presence of refugia within the difficult polar terrain would have attracted both humans and wolves, thus providing a possible means for contact between the two. A 2021 paper by Maria Lahinshin and colleagues argues, and this is based on archaeological and environmental data and calculations of general energy usage within dogs and humans, that humans and wolves would not have experienced great competition in these refugia and could actually have benefited from cooperation in a domesticated scenario, as humans would have survived on little protein due to the constraints of their livers, so they would have been seeking out more fats than lean meats, while the wolves would have preferred the leaner meats. And in this manner, resources could easily be shared between the two. The earliest archaeologically demonstrated domestic dog that belongs to the surviving modern lineage comes from the site of Bonn Oberkassel in western Germany, dated around 14.2 thousand years ago. We have the jaw here at the upper right, and more of the bones to the lower left here on the slide. This dog coexisted with the people of the Magdalenian culture. Having lived towards the end of the last ice age during warmer conditions, these Paleolithic Europeans had returned to a more semi-sedentary lifestyle, and made far more usage out of bone and stone tools than earlier cultures had done. The dog itself was found buried alongside two human adults, covered in a layer of powder made from hematite and overlaid with a thick layer of basalt bricks. Analysis of the bone suggests that the dog had died prematurely, likely suffering from a form of canine distemper virus, which can affect everything from the brain to the digestive tract. In the earlier burials of the wolf dogs weren't clear enough, finds like these make us realize just how precious the dog had become in our early societies. Now, the presence of modern-type dogs in Europe 14,000 years ago, and the decline in wolf dog remains from around this time, suggests that the former gradually replaced the latter. Why should this be? Especially if both types of dogs were performing the same sorts of functions. Well, to that we can't say for sure. Sometimes situations like this just come down to luck or to personal preferences. Maybe when new Paleolithic societies emerged in Europe at the close of the Pleistocene epoch, these new dogs from Central Eurasia may have been seen as easier to work with. Maybe they were more friendly. Maybe they're even more aesthetically pleasing than the older wolf dogs. We know of similar scenarios in the early agricultural communities of China, where the domesticated leopard cat was eventually replaced by domestic cats from the Mediterranean, or among the early European farmers, who replaced their primary Southwest Asian source of domestic pigs with the native wild boars of Europe, to whom all European pig breeds now trace their ancestry. At the start of the Holocene, more and more remains of domestic dogs are found, and we can begin to truly make out the subtle skeletal features that distinguish a dog from a wild wolf. In just a few brief examples, the dog's skull is less robust than the wolf. It has a smaller muzzle and a more domed skull lacking a pronounced sagittal crest. The teeth are much smaller, and they have more crowns. The lower jaw is straighter and curves less. And of course, the overall body size is much smaller. The average wolf spans about 105 to 160 centimeters long and between 72 and 85 centimeters high, while a standard large-sized dog breed like a German Shepherd spans 55 to 66 centimeters long and 56 to 65 centimeters high. And indeed, we see a substantial size decrease in domestic dogs between the early and middle Holocene epoch. With the decline and outright extinction of most of the planet's megafauna, humans and dogs shifted to smaller prey items, as well as in a general decline in social hunting behaviors between dogs. And this is contrary to how some hunters in the United States utilize large packs of dogs. Most prey animals only require one dog to make a catch. And we also see a more widespread diet in these Holocene dogs beyond prey animals. In a 2022 study by Robert J. Losey and colleagues, it was shown that a number of dogs buried at Siberian Holocene sites show evidence that they were consuming not just land-based game, but marine and freshwater seafood, as well as human waste products, including our feces. And this has allowed for the transmission of human-specific pathogens and parasites onto these dogs, while also increasing their general gut biodiversity. And a significant change occurred around 7,000 years ago in a currently unknown locality in Eurasia, perhaps towards the southwest. An increase in the number of copies of a gene called AMY2B, which creates copious amounts of the enzyme amylase in the pancreas to aid in the digestion of starches, shows up in the domestic dog's genome. This adaptation occurs in most of the known dog breeds today, save for several of the ancient varieties. Now, that alone tells us that when human communities made the gradual switch from environmental management of land plants to widespread agricultural production, dogs made the switch as well. They were being fed more and more grains and other starchy foods as the surplus of farming began to outweigh that of wild-caught foods. And indeed, we see a similar amylase enzyme adaptation among agricultural populations of humans today. Since farming spread widely from their varied and disparate centers of origin, the dogs that carried these genes spread as well, and only those dogs that coexisted with surviving forager populations lacked this genetic change. Many molecular analyses have been attempted to try to understand this spread of the modern domestic dog lineage around the world, but until recently have had their share of problems. For one, contemporary dog breeds today are the end result of so much admixture between older dog breeds who themselves are admixed. So teasing out deeper ancestral lineages can be tricky with all of that genetic noise. And our lists of pedigree dog breeds only go back so far, obviously not enough to reach back into prehistory, so they're no help in calibrating the results. For another, the types of DNA sequences and their overall completeness can play a huge role on what results a geneticist acquires. As is the case for human beings, dog mitochondrial and Y chromosomal sequences do not readily correlate with each other, so whole genomes are more likely to provide clearer results. For the few ancient breeds that still exist, a researcher would need the genome of a dog that is not descended from substantial interbreeding with other more recent dogs. And in this day and age, they're harder and harder to find, so much so that some scientists seek out museum specimens that date to the age of European colonization for many samples that they can get. And of course, we have ancient DNA as well that can help us with older samples that are not blurred by all of that genetic noise. So, the most recent studies have acquired more DNA samples from more dogs than ever before. And while there are still gaps in knowledge and uncertainties, a rough picture can be drawn as seen in the consensus tree here on this slide. From the earliest modern domestic dogs that plausibly were tamed by the ancient North Eurasians, dogs traveled westward and eastward across the continent, coming into contact with peoples who in turn spread out even further, sometimes into other continents. Based on DNA sequences as well as the lack of the gene copies of AME2B, it seems that the first lineage of dogs to branch out were the Southeast Asian ancestors of the dingoes and the relatives of Australia and New Guinea, or what we call Sahul, to use the name of the ancient continent when the two landmasses were connected. These dogs are quite strange and have been curiosities of later naturalists, which is something that we'll explore more in a little bit. Now, members of this line also appear to have spread out into the Pacific Islands. The second lineage split into two lines that have subsequently combined and split from each other over numerous times in the pre-agricultural past, hence why this tree has some straight lines and some slashed grayer lines that indicate admixture. One line made an early entry into the African continent, while another followed humans as they began to settle in the Americas. And another line of that branch would also retrace the journey much later in time as the Dorset and Thule people settled the North American Arctic. Now, one branch settled around the Karelian region of present-day Finland, Sweden, and Russia, while another settled around the borderlands of Siberia and northern China. Once agriculture began to emerge in some parts of the world, the AME2B gene became more widespread over the years. One lineage of these dogs accompanied the Anatolian farmers in settling Europe. The majority of these lineages have since then spread out even further over the surface of the earth, accompanying both Neolithic agriculturalists and nomadic Bronze Age pastoralists, and coming into contact with other dogs. And so, even as the genetic spread of European dogs during the age of colonization has masked much of the genomes of other dogs around the world, researchers have still been able to detect these deep roots in the dog family tree. Now, no more frustrating mystery over the years has perplexed scholars of dog history than the origin of the dingo and its close relative, the New Guinea wild dog. Alongside humans, bats, and rodents, they are the only placental mammals to have crossed Wallace's line into Sahul, that is Australia, New Guinea, and the Melanesian Islands. Even in the age of genomics, researchers have been baffled about just what these dogs are. It is fairly clear that they are very closely related to both wild gray wolves and to domestic dogs, but to what extent? Are they a unique wild dog species related to wolves? Are they domestic dogs that have undergone fertilization? Were they ever domesticated? Or were they even just tamed only? All these questions have been asked, and attempts to get answers have been made And as far as the discourse stands now, and that's as of this recording in 2023, of course, a new study can always shake things up. The most recent work suggests that the dogs of Sahul are an early diverging lineage of the modern domestic dog clade, one that predates all known dog breeds. And this is especially clear from their minuscule number of AMY2B gene copies. So this is a line of dogs that predates agriculture. So, okay, well, since both the dingo and the New Guinea dogs coexist with Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, then they must have entered Sahul alongside them, right? Well, that doesn't appear to be the case. The oldest archaeological evidence for the dingo in Australia dates back to roughly 1450 BC, while the oldest New Guinea dog dates to between 500 and 300 BC. Now, there is evidence of Sahulan-type dogs in China and Thailand between 7,000 and 4,000 years ago, and there's some genetic data to suggest a link between these and the Australian dogs. In the most comprehensive study of Sahulan dogs, by Kylie M. Cairns and Alan N. Wilton, it's a 2016 paper, they found that the dingoes descend from two population splits with the New Guinea dogs between 8,300 and 7,800 years ago. Now, meanwhile, despite all of this, evidence of occupation by Homo sapiens in Sahul begins roughly 65,000 years ago. So there is a very clear, huge gap between the migrations of humans and dogs onto the continent. Not to mention a clear gap between them and the earliest of all domestic dogs in Eurasia. Therefore, for the majority of their existence, Aboriginal Australians and Papuans did not rely on dogs to aid in their survival in these new worlds. They had to acquire an intimate knowledge of their lands all on their own. So there were no dogs to help protect Aboriginal Australians from Thylacoleo, for example. So how did dogs get to Sahul in the first place? Given how impossible it is for non-flying mammals to cross Wallace's line, and not for us because we can make watercraft, it is unlikely that dogs swam or island hopped on their own. The majority of researchers agree that humans introduced them to Sahul, but as to the identity of these people, that has remained a mystery. There is just no archaeological presence for such a movement at these key times. It was once proposed that people from South Asia sailed to Australia around 4,200 years ago, and thus may have brought the dingo, but the genetic results of that study were faulty and were later proved inaccurate, so that's out. Recent DNA on southern Sulawesi, on the seafaring Tuwalian peoples, has led some researchers to suggest that they were the ones to introduce dogs, but no evidence for that exists yet. The Makassar, who are also people of Sulawesi, did not begin their trading contacts with Aboriginal Australians until the 500s AD, so they're too recent to explain things. For now, we can't say much on the subject, beyond the fact that the movement of these dogs must have been by non-agricultural peoples, or at the very least farmers who didn't rely on starchy crops. And once there, the dingo and New Guinea dogs acquired their own adaptations. The Highland variety, or singing dog of New Guinea, is so named because it doesn't bark, rather making a call that has been likened to yodeling. They are not pack-forming, and they tend to live alone, foraging in the woods for small game and fruits, and resting in hidden areas like tree crevices, kind of like how a cat does. And also like a cat, they can climb certain trees due to their flexible spine and limbs. Nowadays, purebred New Guinea singing dogs are very rare. They've interbred with other breeds so many times in the recent past. And they seem to have been much more feral and avoided people often, as far as ethnographic accounts have reported. But still, people would sometimes take puppies in and rear them, occasionally taking guardianship roles. But unfortunately, and admittedly, our information on the relationship between Papuans and the singing dogs is very limited. With the dingo, on the other hand, we have much more information. That's a mainly open terrain dog. In the outback, they can go a few weeks without water, and they can apparently detect groundwater. They will either hunt alone or in packs, bringing down a number of prey species, including kangaroos and wombats. They'll also forage on small invertebrates and reptiles, as well as plant foods. So from here on out, I should clarify that nearly all dogs are technically omnivores, and not strict carnivores like cats. And in the case of the dingo, they're over-reliance on meat has actually affected their metabolism over the generations. They are prone to having high cholesterol levels for a dog. While dingoes can bark, they rarely do so, mainly communicating with growls to display dominance or defense. So Aboriginal Australians have an oral tradition of some boating peoples bringing the dingo to their continent, but they do not agree on whether the transfers were on purpose or accidental. In any case, the best evidence we have tells us that the dingo was not fully domesticated like most dog breeds today, but was rather in a semi-domesticated state. They are mainly free-ranging and free-breeding, and so are not required to rely on humans to propagate their numbers. They will coexist with people, but they are not dependent on them for resources or care. And this could possibly explain that apparent gap in time from the earliest reported genetic divergences of dingoes from New Guinea dogs by 7,800 years ago, and their first known appearance at specific Aboriginal sites 3,400 years ago. Thus, these dogs, while not attached to humans at the hip, were nevertheless tolerant of them, and likely sought out human settlement sites from the time of their first arrival. But still, numerous ethnographic accounts point to the myriad ways that Aboriginal Australians used the dingo. That they could be intimate companions is evident. From the earliest archaeological sites, dingoes were intentionally buried after death in much the same way that humans were. They were used as guardians against other humans, as well as malevolent spirits, and they accompanied women on foraging trips to help seek out potential meals. Hunters, in contrast, rarely found uses for dingoes. They make apparently lousy hunters and more often scare prey away than catch it. The puppies were well beloved, often earning much grooming and feeding and cuddling, and in the grand tradition of many indigenous groups, were even suckled by their human owners. If particular nomadic trips were tough, the dogs would be carried along the way. Their spread alongside humans in Australia was vast, reaching across the continent, but curiously they did not enter Tasmania to accompany the people there. It has been proposed that the arrival of the dingo in Australia created competition with the thylacine and the Tasmanian devil, which contributed to their extinction on the mainland by 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, but this has received increasingly little support in recent years and seems less likely now. As Pat Shipman has observed in her recent book, the dogs of Sahul may represent one of the only living breeds that could help us understand what dogs may have been like in their original semi-domesticated state. And it is telling that many dogs today and in the recent past that have become feral, especially across parts of Africa and southern Eurasia, end up developing a dingo-like phenotype over the generations, which is telling. Now, genetic evidence strongly suggests that dogs accompanied the first peoples into the Americas. In a 2021 paper by Angela R. Perry and colleagues, the lineages of Siberian and American dogs line up almost perfectly in time with those of humans. As the populations of northeast Siberia diverged between the ancestors of the Paleo-Siberians and the peoples of Beringia, so too did their dogs. And roughly 21,000 years ago, the ancestral Amerindians brought their dogs into continental North America, and beyond to South America, where, alongside the people, dogs experienced an evolutionary radiation by 15,000 years ago. So far, the archaeological record has yet to catch up with these dates. The oldest known dog burials are those of Coster and Stillwell II in Illinois, both about 10,000 years old. Now, that an entry of dogs into the Americas occurred in pre-agricultural times is also apparent by the lack of multiple copies of Amy 2B and the presence of the dingo-like phenotype among many of the reported breeds. While the extreme isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas has been exaggerated somewhat, for example, on the Siberian side there was ample contact well into recent times, there was little evidence of admixture from other dog lineages, save for those dogs who later accompanied the Dorset and Inuit peoples into Arctic North America. So a lot of time has passed for the different breeds to diversify and find their uses among the varied Native American peoples. And their uses were quite varied. Just about any type of job or role you could find for a dog has been described in the pre-Columbian Americas. Dogs could be valuable hunting companions, working with people to bring down large game like muskoxen, caribou, elk, moose, tapirs, peccaries, and even bears and jaguars, as well as many small animals. Some of these dogs underwent rigorous training exercises. The Achuar of the Peruvian Amazon went as far as to toss puppies into freezing water to toughened them up so they could have the strength to fight a jaguar or an ocelot. The Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest had a special breed of Talton bear dog that was the size of a fox terrier yet could hold off a grizzly bear. And some of them were even given bear bone necklaces or piercings on their noses to aid in their abilities. Contrary to the claim that the peoples of the Americas had no beasts of burden, the dog fit the role quite well enough. Of course, the Inuit sled dogs are well known, but on the Great Plains before the reintroduction of the horse, and even after that, people often hitched up to 45 kilograms of housing materials to their dogs when they traveled from place to place. Archaeological records suggest that the Athabascan-speaking peoples from subarctic Canada introduced these types of larger backpacking dogs into the Great Plains about 1,000 years ago, where the people before had much smaller breeds. Now, these traveling peoples, who are the ancestors of the Apache and Diné, or Navajo peoples, likely crossbred certain dogs to acquire the bulky bodies needed to carry such loads. As early as 1590, Spanish colonists and explorers noted that the Athabascan peoples often had whole trains of dogs carrying their goods, easily keeping up with their walking travelers. Andean peoples sometimes used shaggy-type dogs for herding llamas and alpacas, especially on the treeless grassland plains called puna. Dogs could also be good companions, but here the relationship may become a bit complex for our viewers, because many Native American nations also use these very same dogs as food. The sorts of taboos seen in other parts of the world were not always viewed here. For some groups, dogs were only eaten on special occasions, but for others they were basic subsistence. A dog that was petted and snuggled one day had as much of a chance of being eaten on the next. On the Caribbean islands, the Taino nations had two types of dogs: a small, mostly mute breed called an aon that was often carried around on people's shoulders or in their arms, and were often fattened up before meals, and a second, larger breed that acted as a hunter of large rodents called hutias. But this one was not eaten. Both of these dogs have since died out. In fact, by all accounts, the Spanish explorers who succumbed to the famine of 1494 resorted to eating so many of the smaller dogs that they were the ones who wiped them all out ultimately. All the great Mesoamerican urban societies consumed dogs, from the Olmec to the Aztec, the latter of which featured small dogs alongside rabbits, turkeys, quails, and ducks at their great market. Some of the Iroquoian-speaking peoples around present-day New York would have a special dog feast before going to war, and a similar event occurred for the Natchez of Louisiana. But all the same, these dogs were also loved and cared for as pets are today, and these observations generally follow closely with form and function. So, if a dog was used for herding and backpacking, that was not eaten. But a dog that was eaten would not be considered a hunter or a beast of burden. Now, there are a few select breeds that represent, or have been claimed to represent, surviving pre-Columbian varieties. The Carolina dog of the American Southwest is a dingo-like breed with a tan coat, pointed ears, and curly tail. Nowadays, they're often feral, eking out an existence in the swamps and woodlands. Curiously, this breed was not recognized by Western researchers until the 1950s, when I. Leher Brisbane Jr. came across a feral population in South Carolina. To date, we have no idea which Native American nations owned these dogs or how long this breed has been around. But it may be very ancient indeed, given the phenotype. Much less mysterious is the Mexican hairless dog, or Lolowichili, and I probably butchered that pronunciation, I apologize. That has been documented archaeologically and ethnographically as a breed that existed throughout the Maya and Aztec lands. The hairless trait appears to be a dominant genotypic trait that emerged only once in the breed's history and was retained over the generations. And there was a similar hairless breed that existed in Peru, so maybe they were linked. The Chihuahua is also a Mesoamerican dog, initially recorded as a hairless or short-furred variety, although nowadays they can be seen in a variety of long-haired varieties due to interbreeding with other dogs. Now, more substantial pre-Columbian ancestry exists in some of the Arctic breeds, like the Alaskan Malamute and the Canadian Inuit dog, as well as in the Siberian Husky across from the other continent. Now, these were all beasts of burden that pulled sleds and could also hunt large game. Famously, those dogs also did not bark, but they instead howl and sing, which is vital for alerting danger. Of course, nowadays they make for funny Instagram videos. An interesting side note about pre-Columbian dogs is that they may not have been the only canid to have been utilized as a companion by American peoples. The Yaghan or Yamana people of Tierra del Fuego were reported to have kept a small type of fox called a culpio. This is like Lycalopex culpeus. These so-called Fuegian dogs, or Fuegian foxes, are now extinct, but seem to have come in a few coat colors and were generally a very quiet breed. They were not guards, they were not hunters, but instead they were kept to keep the people warm on cold days, which was pretty much every day there. In more distant times, the people of Argentina, as early as 1500 BC, kept another type of fox as a pet. This is Deucecion avis, which is also now extinct. We've talked about this a little bit before on an earlier episode, but it has been speculated that the presence of the wera, or the Falkland Islands fox, on the Falkland Islands, may have been the result of introductions from people, which may explain their apparent tameness to later European visitors like the young Charles Darwin. And as mentioned earlier in this episode, Native Americans much further north would sometimes take and raise gray wolf pups to maturity. So it seems that many different types of canids found pet-type roles in the pre-Columbian Americas. But the level of respect and attention the domestic dog itself received was clearly much greater. Several Native American oral traditions and creation stories feature dogs, including some that have dogs being bestowed to humans from the gods themselves. So there can be no doubts that dogs in many societies attained spiritual and ritual status, appearing in effigies and other artwork across pre-Columbian societies. For the Aztecs, the god of fire was represented by one dog, who also symbolized a special day on the calendar where owners rubbed ochre on their dogs' heads as a sign of honor. Now, some dogs were sacrificed and even mummified. The photo here at the bottom right shows an Inca dog who was mummified, tied up with rope, and buried with an offering of dried fish. Now, unfortunately, the story of pre-Columbian dogs ends on a sad note. Much as with the great majority of peoples and cultures on the continents, they were wiped out by the European conquests. They were either wiped out totally, like the Caribbean dogs who were eaten, or they were interbred so heavily with European dogs that their original ancient genomes are just gone. So while this DNA survives today in many of these aforementioned American dog breeds shown here on this slide, there is very little of it in unadmixed form, and so therefore researchers sadly contend nearly all of the purebred pre-Columbian breeds are technically considered extinct. The oldest known domestic dogs in East Eurasia, here spanning the Himalayas and everything east of that, come from agricultural communities in southern China. The Tianyoshan site in Zhejiang province belongs to the Hemudu culture, who lived 7,000 years ago and were among the first people to utilize the flooding of the Yangtze River to cultivate rice. These dogs, based on coprolite samples, appear to have lived among the rice fields and were mainly fed a plant-based diet, or at least were foraging around the farmer's scraps. Dogs have also been found at the early agricultural centers of the Hua River, at sites like Shangdun, Yuhushun, and Hutaying between 7,300 and 6,000 years ago. Now, in contrast to the Yangtze dogs, these were being fed ample amounts of meat, and likely assisted in hunting expeditions for deer and boars, and then getting rewarded with parts of the kills. The Jomon sedentary foragers of the Japanese archipelago also appear to have had dogs. In the Kamilkarira rock shelter, remains have been found dating to between 7,400 and 7,300 years ago. And as these peoples mainly subsisted on an abundance of wild resources, their dogs often acted as hunting companions and became so highly revered as to gain substantial burials after death. Genetic studies indicate that these dogs were ancestral to those that followed humans into the islands of the wider Pacific, and perhaps contributed ancestry to the ancestors of the Dingo and New Guinea dogs. But in any case, this same evidence also shows that over the last 5,000 years or so, Central Asian steppe pastoralists, and these were likely Indo-European speakers, entered the Chinese region, and their dogs proceeded to oversweep the genetic profile of the older breeds. So now many dog breeds in China today, and elsewhere, share ancestry with those dogs rather than the early farming breeds. Still, this part of the world boasts a number of fairly old breeds. The Korean Jindo, for example, is one of the surviving dog breeds that today shares substantial genetic ancestry with the earlier farming dogs. They have the tan coat, pointed ears, and curly tails typical of the oldest dog lineages, though nowadays they come in a variety of sizes and colors. The Chow Chow dates from Imperial China. It is a large, stocky, heavily fluffy breed with a big purple tongue and a strongly protective attitude to boot. Indeed, early Chinese accounts tell us that these dogs were used in war and as defensive guardians, having a bite that has been known to kill. Now, the lion-like appearance and personality was certainly well intended by the ancient Chinese, though it is a misconception that the famous Chinese guardian lion statues are based on the Chow Chow. Another famous and stocky ancient Chinese breed is the Shar-Pei, having more wrinkles than fur. Sculptures of Shar-Peis, or at least Shar-Pei-like dogs, date back to the Eastern Han Dynasty of 25 to 220 AD, and they were also used as guard dogs. Though it's an iconic breed today, we almost lost the Shar-Pei, as the great conflicts in China during the 20th century almost led to the breed's extinction. And it's thanks to the concerned efforts of Mat Go-law in the 1970s, who managed to rescue the several remaining Shar-Peis from Hong Kong and Thailand, open a kennel to care for them, and send a plea to the American Kennel Club, that the Shar-Pei's numbers have now been growing fast. But now a similar fate almost befell the Japanese Shiba Inu, which almost died out during World War II and had to be rescued through the admixture of several isolated Japanese populations. Now today, the Shiba Inu is a beloved and iconic dog, and as it was bred as a hunting dog so many millennia ago, it retains an independent and spirited attitude that requires an equally spirited owner. Now another old Japanese breed is the Akita, which is similar to the Shiba Inu but also comes in more coat colors. And like it was also bred as a hunter, able to take down elk and brown bears. And when the age of the samurai came, these dogs were translated into valuable companions. Since 1931, the Japanese government has dedicated an entire operation to maintain the breeding of the Akita and limit intermixing with other dogs. Now, of course, the legacy of the early East Eurasian dog also includes a notable movement out of the continent. The genetic studies have tracked an almost parallel movement of dogs with the Austronesian expansion, which brought taro farming seafarers from southern China down through Taiwan and island Southeast Asia and out east to the Pacific Islands over 3,000 years ago. Again, we also have evidence to suggest that its ancestry was also shared with the dogs that eventually settled Sahul, although the dating also rules out the possibility that the Austronesian-speaking peoples were the ones to introduce dogs there. Now, unfortunately, these original dogs, like most of the pre-Columbian breeds, are now extinct. The original Polynesian dog, one of which is shown here as a stuffed specimen, was a small-bodied, pointed-eared, short-legged breed, so almost kind of like a little tiny dingo, that diversified into a number of local forms as they were established on the islands. At the time of European colonization, explorers found evidence of dogs all throughout Melanesia, save for New Caledonia and New Hebrides, on the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, and across Polynesia, except for islands like Tonga, Rapa Nui, Mangareva, and the Southern Cook Islands. Now, why dogs were absent in some islands is unclear. Although archaeological evidence is lacking, they may have accompanied the initial settlers and subsequently died out, or they even died out on the journeys to those islands. We know, for example, that on the Marquesas Islands, a type of dog once existed because carved representations on stone have been found, as well as a few burial sites, but to date, that is the only evidence that dogs once lived there. As in other parts of the world, Polynesian dogs had a number of uses. They could be quiet companions. By all accounts, the breed did not bark, but could howl. Some dogs were used for hunting, where there were sufficient game animals to be found, such as the Solomon Islands. The famous avifauna of New Zealand were no doubt pursued by hunting dogs back in the day. And a 2021 review paper by Karen Gregg and Nicholas J. Rollins argues that dogs contributed to the eventual extinction of much of the fauna on those islands. A common use of the dog was for food. The Hawaiian poi dog was regularly fattened up with taro roots like a pig and consumed, and they were never used for any other tasks like hunting. The Tahitian dog was treated in much the same way, even reared alongside pigs in the home. Many parts of the dog that weren't eaten were turned into valuable items. Skin and pelts became clothing, and teeth became jewelry or fish hooks. Now, as stated before, the Polynesian dog is now extinct. As Europeans sailed and settled in the Pacific, they brought their own dogs with them, and much of the time these interbred and overshadowed their ancient genetic signature. The work of Christian missionaries also had an unintentional effect on the loss of these dogs. As the earlier religious and culinary uses of dogs were stamped out, soon the need for the dogs themselves was as well, and many of them died from starvation and lack of care. This is another bittersweet end to an interesting part of the world. The transition from the Paleolithic wolf dogs to the modern European lineages seems to have happened within a period of roughly 18 to 15,000 years ago, particularly when we start to find burials like those at Montespan in France, which has been genetically identified as part of the modern dog lineage. There is evidence of at least two main lines of dogs in prehistoric Europe. One of those are the Mesolithic dogs of the Karelian or Finnish clade that was established prior to 10,900 years ago, and those that accompanied the Anatolian farmers over 7,000 years ago, and thus introduced agriculture into Europe. By all the genetic data, it seems that both of these lineages share more in common with the dogs of East Eurasia than with those of the nearby Levant, and that can be explained by the movements of dogs across Central Eurasia. Since then, one of these Neolithic dog lines, and that's related to one which was buried at a megalithic site in Sweden around 5,000 years ago, had spread widely from the north and effectively homogenized the genomic landscape of European dogs. Now, which human groups were behind that movement, we can't really say for sure, but the timing does seem to correspond with the movements of the Indo-European speaking peoples within Europe. Europe, of course, is one of the biggest hubs of modern dog diversity today, and nearly all of the modern breeds seen around the world ultimately hail from here. But there's at least one type of living dog breed that descends from a much more ancient line, and that is the Finnish Spitz, which is a dingo-like dog with a fluffy, curly tail. That's been traced to the early Finno-Ugaric speaking peoples of present-day Finland and western Russia. They were, and sometimes still are, used as expert hunting dogs that could track down and catch elk and game birds. Like the Shar-Pei and other aforementioned breeds, we would have almost lost the Finnish Spitz in the 1880s to extensive interbreeding had it not been thanks to the work of one man, Hugo Roos, who collected the last few purebred specimens and grew their numbers. Now, there has been a number of dogs that have been claimed to be really old breeds, like the Eurasier from Germany and the Irish Wolfhound, but to date, these claims have either been debunked or left unclear. In the case of the Eurasier, we now know from DNA analysis that the breed was formed in the 1960s through admixture with different ancient breeds, so there's a false impression of deep genetic ancestry when the DNA of those dogs are sequenced, so you kind of have to tease that out a little bit. The Irish Wolfhound is a bit tricky, because while Wolfhound-like dogs have been described as far back as the pre-Roman Celtic societies, true Irish Wolfhounds have only been traced back about as far as the late 1700s, when it almost died out because wolves were hunted to extinction in Ireland, and therefore there was no need for a dog breed to hunt wolves. So what about dogs in the classical societies of Europe, like Greece and Rome? Thankfully, we have quite a lot of ample evidence that the ancient Greeks and Romans had many types of dogs and many uses for them, not least of all in their literature. As early as the Homeric Odyssey do we find the heartbreaking moment when Odysseus returns home and is initially only recognized by his old dog Argos, who has just enough strength to drop his ears, wag his tails, and die. The Iliad and the Odyssey are supposed to take place in the context of Mycenaean Greece, which spans 1700 to 1150 BC, and this is before the classical period. Their dogs, which are described as hound-like, were used as hunters of animals from ducks to lions, even though the Mycenaeans do not appear to have made meat a large part of their diet. They saved their livestock for sacrifices instead. In the later time of archaic and classical Greece, so about 750 to 330 BC, dogs continued to be used as hunters and guardians, and our sources become a little bit better. We know, for example, that the iconic spiked collar is a Greek invention to protect hunting dogs from wolf bites. and dogs gained spiritual status, including as the three-headed Cerberus who guarded Hades' underworld, and the hunting companions of Artemis. At least 4 breeds can be discerned in ancient Greece: the Laconian hunting hound, the Molossian mastiff for guarding and warfare, the Meletian lapdog, and the Cretan crossbreed that was a working mastiff. Ancient Rome boasts even more written sources for dog breeds and care, and as the Romans conquered the Grecian islands, we can learn even more about them through visual representations like mosaics. The one on the right here, for example, shows a guard dog. Despite having a myriad number of animals to rear from across the Republic and later the Empire, the Romans considered the dog their favorite. They were highly valued. Anyone who first owned a farm was encouraged to own at least 2 dogs to help protect the livestock and crops. Poetry was written about dogs, and in a very touching manner, we have many dog burials that are accompanied by gravestones with text from their owners. And of course, I encourage everyone to watch Invicta's wonderful video on the dogs of Rome. I'll link that in the description. By the accounts we have, the Romans recognized many more dog breeds, including those from conquered territories. So we have the Vertragus, which is a greyhound-like breed from Celtic Gaul. And we have the early Italian breeds, the Etruscan and the Umbrian. And we also see small toy dogs, the Cachalai, that was often treated with as much adoration and babying as toy dogs are today. Now, because dogs were most likely domesticated in Central Eurasia, the southwestern part of the continent seems like the most likely route by which the varied peoples of Africa acquired dogs. Indeed, from the early genetic evidence obtained from a 7,000-year-old individual from the Levantine Neolithic, that appears to be the case. Now, while other dogs of considerable age have been dated to about 5.8 thousand years ago in Iran, the dogs of Africa show a notable link with the ones from the Levant instead, so that suggests a possible route. The oldest known dog in the African archaeological record comes from pre-dynastic Egypt, about 5,900 years ago. And from there, it can actually be traced down into the east and down south within the last 1,000 years. So there's no doubt that both the Bantu and pastoralist expansions within the last 5,000 years contributed to the dog's spread. In fact, when Europeans encountered the Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherers in southern Africa, they were accompanied by dogs, which assisted in the hunt. Until colonial times, the dogs of Africa have received little to no admixture from foreign breeds. However, genetic evidence implies that dogs may have entered Africa even earlier than this. The Basenji is a curious dog breed that was originally associated with Central African foragers and their neighbors. It does not bark, instead making a yodeling sound like the dogs of New Guinea. And like these breeds, its estrus cycle only occurs annually, and not biannually or more like all the other modern dog breeds. And of course, there is the so-called pariah dog morph that many feral dogs revert to that I talked about earlier, which make it resemble a dingo. As Basenji DNA has been deciphered, we find it is one of the few breeds today that lacks the multiple copies of AMY2B, and that is key. The earliest burials of dogs in Africa and Southwest Asia are all in Neolithic farming contexts, so the ancestors of the Basenji must have entered the continent in pre-agricultural times. But when, we can't say. The Basenji thus may constitute one of the oldest diverging dog lineages after those who settled Sahul. Back in Southwest Asia, dogs came into contact with other farming dogs from Europe through a series of back migrations starting 7,000 years ago. This, combined with movements from the Iranian plateau, shaped the genetic blueprints of dogs in a process of admixture that was complete by 2.3 thousand years ago. As in classical Greece and Rome, the ancient urban societies of Egypt and Mesopotamia also record accounts of domestic dogs. Like the Greeks, the Sumerians associated dogs with some of their deities. Inanna, or Ishtar, was accompanied by 7 hunting dogs, complete with collar and leash. In fact, the collar and leash shows up the earliest in ancient artwork in either Egypt or Mesopotamia. But there was probably a lot of cultural borrowing in this part of the world, so it's kind of hard to pin that down. Now, the Saluki, like the Irish wolfhound, has been claimed to be depicted on Sumerian cylinder seals, but despite the discourse about that, the genetics does point to them being a very old breed, to the point where some people have joked that the dogs on Noah's Ark would have been Salukis. A closely related breed, the Afghan Hound, shares a very lengthy and beautiful coat that comes in different colors. These sight hounds are popular with dog shows today, but their original use appears to have been for tracking down gazelles and other fast-moving game. And then there's the Canaan dog, which shares with the Basenji the very ancient pariah phenotype. They appear to have been used as guardians of nomadic herds, and likely accompanied the early Israelites as they developed their culture. The dog, of course, features prominently in ancient Egypt, but the history of these breeds is tricky. Despite certain claims, the greyhound does not date from the Pharaonic age, but is rather traced back to Europe within the last few centuries. Nonetheless, greyhound-like dogs are known in Egypt, some of which were among the many animals that were mummified if a family could afford it. The death of a pet dog in ancient Egypt was just as sad as a dog's death is today, and it's recorded that the ancient Egyptians showed grief by shaving their eyebrows. So this is an admittedly incomplete look at the early history of dogs around the world. Where does the story leave us as we approach the present day? As I mentioned a couple of times, and as surprising as it may sound, almost all of our modern breeds of dogs can be traced back to within the last 300 years or so. While the varied morphs of dogs we're familiar with today, hounds and terriers, mastiffs, herders, and toy dogs, and more, are attested and accounted for, in very ancient times, specific breeds, like the Beagle, the Labrador Retriever, Scottish Terrier, German Shepherd, and Poodle, are not very old. In a 2017 analysis of dogs by Heidi G. Parker and colleagues, they found, for example, that every Bulldog and Terrier cross in the world today can be traced back to a population of Irish Terriers between 1860 and 1870, coinciding with a growing interest in dogfighting. So while the foundational stocks of these dogs may have been traced back genetically to late medieval times across various European nations, it was the Victorian-era British who really started the modern obsession with dog breeding. The first kennel clubs were established, and following examples of cattle and horse stud books, these groups began to systematically track and record the pedigrees of all these new dog breeds. Even today, many owners can boast that their dogs can be traced to particular lines going back centuries. And of course, from the age of colonization some 600 years ago onwards, Europeans have brought their own dogs with them to the varied continents and islands they settled in. Thus, the majority of the world's dog breeds contain some ancestry dating back to those early Neolithic European lines of less than 7,000 years ago, to the point where many pre-colonial lines like the Pre-Columbian dogs and Oceanian dogs are effectively extinct. Which is a curious side note, because even European and American breeds of dogs have died out in recent times. One such example is that of the English Water Spaniel, which was a beautiful curly-haired piebald breed that originally was used as a duck hunter. In the 1890s, it was increasingly rare, and by the late 1960s, it appeared that the breed was just gone, but not before contributing ancestry to the American Water Spaniel and curly-coated retriever. So the thumbprint of extinction does not spare even our own pets. Today, modern kennel clubs around the world typically recognize around 450 distinct breeds, with new members being added every year, either as a legitimately new breed or as a previously unrecognized breed. So that number is probably higher. I have fond memories every Thanksgiving of watching the dog show, so I can take in the spectacular diversity of dogs and see what new breeds will show up. I mean, we really have come a long way in changing Canis lupus familiaris in such a manner that mirrors the adaptive radiations of naturally evolving animals. And it's thanks to the many variations of the dog and other domestic species that led early naturalists like Charles Darwin to speculate on natural selection in a larger temporal context. I often wonder, had some of these dog breeds evolved naturally and then later come into contact with each other, like say if the Chihuahua and the Great Dane evolved naturally in the wild from gray wolves, would they even be able to breed, and thus would we consider them separate species? But even something as prolific as dog breeding can have serious drawbacks. The two images above, to the right, are over 100 years old. These black and white photos come from a book, Walter Elspin Mason's 1915 Dogs of All Nations, which which is an early encyclopedia of dog breeds from various countries that features illustrations and photos. I'll post a link in the description to the Internet Archive where you can actually read this book. The color images on the right are the same breeds of dogs as they appear today. And right away, I hope, one can see clear distinctions in body type to almost remarkable degrees. The Bull Terrier, which is an English breed that was one of those Bulldog Terrier crosses for dogfighting, is today well known in popular culture and is a favorite of many families. But within 100 years, preferences and standards have changed. Today, the Bull Terrier sports a so-called egg face, where the brow and snout are no longer separated by a dip. The body's also become notably stockier and short-legged. Originally, Bull Terriers were all white. But in time, genetic health problems began to emerge from such strict practices of breeding. So by the early 20th century, other terrier mixes were crossbred with Bull Terriers to produce brindled and other coated types. Even so, now the Bull Terrier still faces many health problems from its strict genetic pedigree. For example, many are born blind and have other sight disorders, and several others are more susceptible to kidney and heart disease. Or take the Dachshund, the famed wiener dog. This was originally bred in Germany as a small, long-bodied hound that could aid in hunting small burrowing mammals. The early Dachshunds were not always so short-legged and belly-dragging, but since the breed has changed from a hunting dog to a lap dog, the need for a maneuverable body was lessened. And so today, the Dachshund is heavily prone to health risks of the spine, where the intervertebral discs will calcify and impede the dog's ability to move. People have created a breed that is more at risk of disease than it was 100 years ago. And so this goes for many other breeds, well-known and otherwise. Of course, all dogs are susceptible to genetic diseases and illnesses, such as life. But the way that some dogs have been bred have made the situation much worse. It's as if people forget that when they breed dogs for the purpose of designing the perfect specimen, or even keeping with breed standards, they forget that they're working on living animals whose bodies will have to live with such extreme changes in body types. Thankfully, these concerns have been and are being addressed by many groups who are working with some dogs to rebreed them back into their original morphologies. In just one instance for today, the people behind Pug Dog Passion, and I'll link them in the description, are trying to bring back the original pug, which was a Chinese breed brought to Europe during the 1500s. If you look at early portraits and photographs from across the centuries, you'll see that pugs originally had proper snouts. But it was about the 1860s when the modern type of brachycephalic snout was bred, giving the pug that weird smushed face. And unfortunately, this was one of those changes that proved a detriment to the dogs. Now pugs have more exposure to many nose, throat, and eye illnesses that affect their breathing and sight. Pugs have even inherited a disease called pug dog encephalitis, which creates inflammation in the brain. Now, these new breeding groups like Pug Dog Passion are crossbreeding pugs with other dogs to produce forms that more closely resemble the earlier breeds with snouts, significantly decreasing their susceptibility to these terrible illnesses. So on the bottom here, you can see a sort of progress shot of the pug's breed history in these images below. Projects like these are really remarkable, and you know what? They may play a vital role in answering a great question for which there is much controversy. Are mutts and other crossbred dogs healthier than purebreds? In any case, no matter if they're purebred or not, most of us today love dogs, and if this condensed and simplified history of dogs is anything to go by, people since Paleolithic times have loved them too. Whether they were venerated or marked as great hunters or viewed as food or seen as our best friends, the dog has become an almost ubiquitous feature of human societies. So perhaps in the list of proposed traits that make us human, we should add an inordinate fondness for dogs. And so that is it for our special episode today. I want to thank you all for joining us. Of course, we are on Patreon, so if you want to support us with any monetary donations you can go to patreon.com/timeandclades, where your contributions will help us to continue the series and develop new projects and expansions. And of course, our general acknowledgments. We want to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to this series. Henry, of course, is responsible for the music that opens our episodes, and Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Alvarezor avatar. I also want to thank Marcia Carala again for letting us use her image of the Paleolithic wolf dogs. We will link to her social medias and websites in the description. And I also want to personally dedicate this episode to my partner, Alari Patia. We recently celebrated our 6-month anniversary here in March, and I could not be more grateful to have such a kind, caring, and fun person to spend my days with. Alari, you are the love of my life, and I hope you enjoyed my special lengthy exploration of dogs, since I know you're a big dog lover yourself. And of course, if you're on Twitter, you can follow us at Time and Clades, where we post our episodes, but most likely you're watching us here on our YouTube page through Time and Clades, so if you want to like and subscribe, we appreciate that. If you have any questions about the show, whether about the history of dogs that I have just discussed, you want me to elaborate on some things more, or just questions about anything in general, you can shoot us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com, or you can message us on Twitter or on our YouTube comment section. And of course, many studies were relied on for the creation of this episode. So if you want to learn even more about the history of dogs, you can go to the description for links to references and others for this episode. I will be sure to specify all of those for everyone. But with that, that is it for our special episode today. If you have dogs, give them a hug and a kiss because they have a remarkable history. Till then, we'll see you all later. Take care.